discussing ideological power. Our case for examination is Islamic fundamentalism, which is arguably one of the most, if not the most important forces of ideological power in the world today. Although it is, perhaps surprisingly, has not been that way for actually very long. So, here's New York on September 11, 2001. I think you guys are the last class that I will teach that was born after this happened rather than before. I think my next year's students will be the first ones born after this. So, what happened? Why was the United States attacked by agents of Al-Qaeda on September 11th, 2001? Well, they were actually really clear about it, about why they did this. And they said that they had three reasons. Their first reason was that they wanted to have United States troops removed from Saudi Arabian soil. They said further they wanted sanctions lifted against Iraq, which had been in place since the 1990s. And third, that they wanted the United States to withdraw its support from Israel. And by the way, notably, two of those three things we did. We actually did remove our troops from Saudi Arabian soil, which was arguably their biggest complaint. And we did withdraw the sanctions from Iraq, although after we invaded Iraq. So there's that. So obviously, there is the matter of terrorism to include in this. And so I want to sort of foreground this a little bit, so in using the term, we have a better understanding of what we're actually talking about. So terrorism can be defined basically on the basis of four different qualifying aspects. The first one is that it's violent, or that it uses the threat of violence, but it almost always is violent, with then an established role of violence being demonstrated to the intended victim. Then the threat of subsequent violence is what follows. So it's violent, number one. Number two, it targets civilians. So when soldiers are the target of an attack, it's not technically speaking terrorism. It might be a war crime, or it might be a crime against some other convention of war. The common example that we use is that in the 1980s, a couple hundred United States Marines were killed in Beirut when a member of Hezbollah drove a truck loaded with bombs into the United States Marine barracks. That was unquestionably a crime against the laws of war. But technically speaking, it wasn't terrorism because the targets were a military force. Now, there are less sort of clear distinctions there, obviously. The argument, for instance, might be made, well, what about the police? Are the police a military force? For that matter, the argument might be made, well, what about politicians? Are politicians civilians? Because if they aren't, then the targeting of civilians, of politicians, might be a legitimate way of waging war. In fact, some people would argue that, in fact, it's a much more legitimate way of waging war because you're targeting the people that are actually responsible for things rather than soldiers who are, by and large, drafted. And therefore, you're the category of a victim being innocent is a much less likely thing to happen. So violence against civilians. Third is that there has to be a goal, and it's usually a political goal, which is to say that you're not just attacking for the sake of attacking. You're attacking because you were trying to get a policy change on the part of the citizens of the country that you're attacking, which was very clearly the case on September 11th. And again, I mean, there were very clearly stated things that they were looking to accomplish by doing this. There were also sort of indirect things that they were looking to accomplish. They certainly did hope that we would go to war against them because they were pursuing a particular line of quasi-religious thinking in that regard. But they were also very clearly looking for political goals, and the three that I stated. And the idea that they attacked us because they hate our freedom and stuff like that is probably on some level true, but certainly not the big goal that they were looking to accomplish. Last but not least, there's a tendency to say that terrorism is usually not carried out by a state actor, but some non-state entity, whether it's a guerrilla organization, or a terrorist group like Al-Qaeda that pretty much uniformly only carries out acts of terrorism rather than any kind of action against government forces or things like that. If a government kills civilians, then that's classed differently. It's a crime against humanity, and that falls under a different category in international law. So, to summarize, it's violence or the threat of violence against civilians by non-state actors for a political purpose, usually political purpose, but always for some policy change. So, returning to the topic of ideological power, Michael Mann defines ideological power as that which derives from the human need to find ultimate meaning in life, to share norms and values, and to participate in aesthetic and ritual practices with others. So any religion can be a form of ideological power. And certainly for any religion that has a hierarchy inherent in it, then it's going to almost certainly inhere on that level much more so. And it can then transfer into other forms of power, particularly political power. Now, we say also that there are two subforms of ideological power. There's what's called immanent ideological power, which reinforces existing political structures. So we talked in the last class about the divine right of kings, and that is an immanent form of ideological power. You've already got a monarchy, and you're looking to reinforce that monarchy, and so you circulate an ideology of divine right, and that reinforces that already existing institution. The other form are transcendent forms of ideological power. These are more autonomous, which is to say that they are sort of more self-ruling and self-generating. Most religions exert this form of power because it relies ultimately on the individual worshiper or believer to, first of all, ascribe to the belief, and then second of all, to carry out whatever action is an expression of that form of power. So, in understanding Islamic fundamentalism, it's first necessary to understand Islam. It is an Abrahamic religion related to Judaism and Christianity. So, talk about Abrahamic religions, we just mentioned those religions that acknowledge the biblical Abraham as either the founder or as an important prophet. Like Judaism, it is strictly monotheistic. Christianity teaches belief in a Trinity. Judaism and Islam believe in a unitary Godhead, right? A single God, not divisible, not conceived of in any way other than being unitary. And like Christianity, Islam is heavily redemptionist, which means that there's a big emphasis in Islam, as in Christianity, on what happens after you die. And that because if you are not saved in some way via the vehicle of the religion, then you're not redeemed. Your soul is not redeemed. So for both Christians and for Muslims, it isn't that this life isn't important, but it's that because the afterlife is eternal, that's really sort of where the focus of your actions in everyday life on this earth, where those things are directed. Judaism doesn't strictly teach in an afterlife, and therefore it's much more about sort of the daily practice of ethics rather than aiming for something beyond this particular realm. So Islam's founded in the 7th century by Muhammad in Arabia, what's currently Saudi Arabia. So he claims that he receives a revelation from the angel Gabriel, the same angel that appears in both the Old and New Testaments, and gives him this recitation, this revelation in the form of what becomes the Quran, which just is Arabic for recitation, basically. So he's not literate, so it's necessary for him then to communicate this recitation then to people that can write it down. And in relatively close form, it's what the Quran today is. It is not really substantively different from when it was first written down now almost 1,400 years ago. And over its first 150 years, it conquers a significant amount of territory. So I don't think I have an actual map here, although maybe I do. One sec. I know I have one a little bit later, so I'll page up and then back again. So, although that doesn't actually contain all of the territory. So to give you some idea of the actual territory that's covered, so if this is Saudi Arabia here, within 150 years of Muhammad making the claim of revelation, the Islamic world spreads across North Africa and all the way into Spain, basically up to the Pyrenees Mountains here, and then all the way east to what's current-day Afghanistan and Pakistan. And it will actually eventually reach into India and into Southeast Asia as well as in sub-Saharan Africa, but it's really in sort of that first major thrust of the intention of spreading Islam that it makes its sort of its most impressive gains in terms of how it spreads. Another important thing to understand within the topic of Islam for understanding Islamic fundamentalism is the notion of jihad, which is an Arabic word that means struggle, and that has had multiple historic and contemporary interpretations, bearing in mind that Islam is a 1,400-year-old religion, that it is practiced by 1.5 billion people, not the majority by a long shot of whom are Arab, but in fact the plurality of Muslims are from South Asia, from Pakistan, Bangladesh, and a significant minority in India. And so for cultural reasons, for historical reasons, there have been multiple interpretations of the religion writ large, as well as this particular aspect of the religion called jihad. So it has meant a war of conquest, as well as a war of defense. It has meant war to spread Islam, as in the first 150 years of the history of the religion, although it bears mention that Islam was also spread just through sort of good advertising and through the economic benefits that it offered, because it offered secure trade routes that didn't exist in those areas before, as well as war to defend Islam. And then last but not least, and sort of the most contemporary iteration of this idea of jihad has been one of internal personal struggle. For instance, crises of faith, or the desire to overcome an addiction, those kinds of struggles. So, in the most orthodox sense, jihad is viewed defensively, and it's viewed, when viewed defensively, as being something that is the duty of any observant Muslim, with the reward for death during the waging of jihad being martyrdom, instant entry into heaven. And that's an important aspect of the sort of the rallying aspect of jihad, particularly if you believe very strongly in an afterlife and that it will be really substantively better than this world, and you remove all doubt from whether or not you're going to enter it, then on some level the question might arise as to why wouldn't you? Why wouldn't you risk your life if the reward were going to be this? Last but not least, there is an ideological divide within the Muslim world between Sunni, which basically means traditional, and Shia, which means like the faction. So this conflict is one that pops up within the first 50 years after Muhammad dies, and it has to do with succession. The Sunni prefer the successor to the leader of the faithful to be elected, whereas the Shia prefer that the leadership go via the family of Muhammad. Now, importantly, Muhammad didn't have any sons. He did, however, have a nephew who subsequently became his son-in-law, whose name was Ali. And according to the Shiite branch of Islam, the leadership of the faithful should be in Ali's line. The majority of Muslims in the world are Sunni, about 85%. And then the Shia make up most of the rest, with a couple of then very small denominations. In Iran, the Shia are the overwhelming majority, more than 90%. They're also a majority in Iraq, 60%, and in Bahrain, which is an island nation on the Persian Gulf. They are significant minorities in Lebanon, in Syria, and in Yemen, where you might know in the last case there's currently a Sunni-Shia civil war going on. Now, importantly, I should point out that because geographically speaking, there's been a pretty clear divide between where Sunnis are most numerous and where Shia are most numerous. Sunni and Shia fighting each other is the exception and not the rule. And when they have, it's usually been over something more substantive than this matter of disbelief. It might evince itself in that. You'll see when these particular disputes take on terrorism as a tactic, then you'll see one denomination bombing the mosques of the other denomination. And they'll justify doing so by saying that the other group aren't real Muslims and that kind of thing. But usually the larger things that are at stake are political and resource related rather than actually religious, because for most of Islamic history this divide has been there and it really hasn't had much effect. Important piece of historical context as well in the 20th century is that until the end of World War I, a significant portion of the old world, as we call it, North Africa, Europe, and Asia Minor being the part of Asia that is to the west of Iran, basically, was held by what's called the Ottoman Empire. So this was a empire run by the Turks. It was capital was here in the city today called Istanbul, then called Constantinople. And as you can see, at its greatest extent, it was rather large. It went as far north as almost into parts of Poland and Ukraine, into the Caucasus Mountains, and as far west as Algeria. And it wasn't really until this land was defeated, but the Ottoman Empire rather was defeated as an ally of Germany and Austria in World War I, that this empire was divided. And it's important not only because of the territorial implications, which we'll get to, but also because this was actually the seat of where the leadership for Sunni Muslims worldwide was headquartered. And since then, since 1922 or thereabouts, there has been no sort of central place where the Sunni faithful could be led from. Whereas, by and large, the Shia faithful have been led for most of Shia history from Iraq. And although under Saddam Hussein that was far less the case, it's sort of made that particular kind of renaissance. So that would be basically from Baghdad. Questions so far? So modern Islamic fundamentalism has its roots, as I mentioned, relatively recently. And it boils down to some extent to a relationship between two men, Al-Wahhab and Muhammad bin Saud, bin in Arabic meaning the son of. So Abdul Wahhab is a fundamentalist religious leader in Arabia in the 18th century. Anybody know what fundamentalist means? I mentioned it, I think, in passing last Friday, but fundamentalists believe very strongly in the importance of Scripture and its literal interpretation. And because almost by nature Scripture tends to be hundreds, if not thousands of years old, there tends to be a highly traditionalist strain within fundamentalist circles that can be reactionary in terms of seeking to turn the clock back. Now, what's today Saudi Arabia in the 18th century was not at all an advanced place. It was almost overwhelmingly desert. It still is today. But there were no cities to speak of outside of Mecca and Medina, the holy places for the Muslim faithful. But there was sort of a broader cosmopolitan sense of Islam that had been promulgated by the fact that the Ottoman Empire was the standard bearer and military arm of the Muslim world at that point, at least for that part of the world. And people like Abdul Wahab basically were looking to reinstate what they believed Islam was like when Muhammad was alive. And that's basically what fundamentalism within Islam, at least, aims to do. In contrast, Muhammad ibn Saud was just a local warlord. And so because there was no central government, well, there was a central government in Constantinople, but most of the area of Arabia was uncharted, and very few people ever went there who didn't live there or have a good reason to go. The territory was divided up by warlords who just ran the area and governed the people within the area that it was sensible to travel maybe within a couple of days' journey. And Ibn Saud was one of these people. In 1744, they made a lasting alliance between their two families. That Wahab would sort of get a franchise on Islamic belief and would be able to impose his standards within the borders of the area that was controlled by the Saud family. In 1744, this wasn't a big deal because the area that Ibn Saud controlled was small. When the Ottoman state goes into decline in the 19th century, a few things happen that cause this to change. First of all, when the Ottoman Empire goes to war, the Ottoman Sultan makes a call for all citizens, Muslim citizens of the Ottoman Empire to wage jihad. This fails pretty badly, though, and they lose the war, as mentioned, in all of their colonial holdings. France will take control of what is today Syria and Lebanon. And the UK will take control of Palestine, which includes both Palestine and Israel today, as well as what becomes the Kingdom of Jordan, is then called Transjordan, and what becomes Iraq. What this doesn't include and what they divide up is Arabia, and that's because not only is it highly religiously significant to the Muslim faithful, and therefore they want to keep their hand out of it to the extent that they're able, but also because there's a power struggle that emerges there over control of the peninsula, basically. On the one hand, there are the family of the keepers of the holy places in Saudi Arabia, who gives us the monarchy in Iraq and in Jordan, which is still there today. And they have a leader there in Arabia who desires to take over the area. But there's also the Saud family, which gets the favor of the British in particular, who back him. And after a short war, the Saud family wins. And so now this family that had struck this deal almost 200 years earlier to fuse their ideological and military power, now has control over all of Saudi Arabia, and most importantly, when they name it Saudi Arabia after their family, but more importantly, over the holy places of all Muslim people. So you might be aware that there's a lot of oil in the Middle East, and that, in fact, the largest reserves of it are under what is today Saudi Arabia. Among the top 4 countries in the world for oil reserves, outside of the United States and Russia, which both have very large reserves as well, are Saudi Arabia, Iraq, and Iran. So oil is discovered in Iran first, which then is called Persia. The British found the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company the following year. This is the company that is today known as British Petroleum, or BP. The Turks start up their own oil exploration company a few years later, and they identify oil in Iraq. And then finally, the Arab-American oil company, Aramco, discovers oil in 1938. So this is a huge windfall, as you can probably imagine, for wealth for the people of these countries. Whereas these were countries that had been stunted by their relative lack of development and then being under colonial rule, whether under the Turks first or then under the British and the French for decades, now have more money than they can possibly imagine. Because even though these corporations from the United States and from mainly from the United States and Great Britain, although there are also ones in the Netherlands and in other European countries, although they take the lion's share of the money, there is so much money in petroleum that even the minority cut that these countries get is enough to make them wealthy, more wealthy than they can possibly imagine. And for countries with very small populations like Saudi Arabia or the Emirates around the Gulf that are still there today, this means basically that there's no longer even a requirement for a lot of middle-class people to work anymore. They can institute a welfare state that's paid for by the revenues from oil because there are so few people that the money's just there to be able to do that. For larger countries that have much larger populations like Iraq and Iran, this means change in the form of now a burgeoning middle class and a greater standard of living and built-up infrastructure and things that they didn't have before the end of World War I. There's also very large expenditures that are made for religious education as a result of this windfall in money. So that whereas literacy rates were very low in these countries, there was huge wealth inequality. A very small number of people held most of the wealth in these countries, and the vast majority of people who were involved in things like, herding, basically, or if they lived in a city, they perhaps plied a trade. Now, there are schools for these people to go to, and they can learn to read, and they can become educated. If they can amass some money, they can go to school. They can go to university. The really wealthy ones will go abroad and go to university, and all these sorts of changes will happen as well. But a big chunk of that money, particularly the money that comes into Saudi Arabia, is going to go to funding religious education. And because, remember, the particular brand of Islam that is the state religion in Saudi Arabia since 1744, but since the end of World War I has held the entire peninsula, including the holy places, they're going to be teaching in these schools a particularly fundamentalist version of the faith. And that's highly significant because after all, Saudi Arabia still has a pretty small population, and so the money that they can apportion toward education is not going to need to be very much. But where they're going to begin opening schools then is going to be in Pakistan, and then later in Bangladesh, and then in Indonesia, and in other countries that have very high Muslim populations that are very poor and don't have the resources to provide this education. The deal that goes along with that is that the education that's being provided is going to be of a fundamentalist variety. So, another important thing to acknowledge about the Middle East, not just the Arab world, but Iran as well, and in case I haven't mentioned it already, Iran is not Arab, it's Persian, and so the language is different, and as already mentioned, the denomination of Islam that's practiced in Iran is also different. There are charges of imperialism that are made, and remember, imperialism basically is when one country or a group of people exploits another country or a group of people for their economic resources. And when the economic resource is something as valuable as oil is, the exploitation can be quite great. Now, as I already mentioned, there was an agreement under which France and the UK agreed to divide most of the Arab territory that the Ottomans had held at the end of World War I. This is called the Sykes-Picot Agreement. And the borders that you see in the Middle East today that look very much like they were drawn with a straight-edge ruler look that way because they were literally drawn with a straight-edge ruler. When England and France get together to discuss the prosecution of the war against Turkey and come to a point at which they know they're going to win, there comes a discussion about who's going to get what. And when they divide that, they just take a map out and they draw a line and they say, okay, what's north of this is yours, France, what's south of this is mine, the UK. And only after World War II will France and the UK finally relinquish all of the territory that they take as part of this deal. The second thing is that Israel was founded as a result of this as well, right? So during, and we'll talk about this in a lot more detail when we talk about nationalism, because Zionism falls within that particular sub-area. There is an influential movement for Jewish nationalism in Europe that is aware during World War I that it's likely that Palestine will fall into the hands of the British, and so lobbying for a state for Jewish people in Palestine, what today is Israel, begins during World War I. And because, to some extent, because the British and French are uncomfortable with Muslims, but more comfortable with Jews because they've lived among Jews, or Jews have really lived among them, they back this idea. The problem is that the native population isn't crazy about it because the population of Jews in Palestine at that point numbers maybe a few thousand at the most. And this is obviously still a point of contention 100 years later, so it's not like this problem's gone away. Third, as already mentioned, is oil exploitation. The exploitation. The business deals, as I mentioned, don't favor the native people. They favor the corporations that have done the exploration. And in many cases, this is in fact, in all of the cases, it's highly beneficial to the countries. The question is just how beneficial over what they might have if all of that money actually fell into their own hands. Last but not least, there are repeated military interventions on the part of the West, mainly by the United States and by the UK, in the Middle East over the course of several decades. First, there is an invasion of Iran in 1941 by the United States and the Soviet Union. This is done to overthrow the then Shah of Iran, who has backed Germany in the war. In 1953, go into more detail in a moment, there is another operation carried out by the United States in Iran, this time to reinstate the Shah of Iran, who has been overthrown in a sort of populist Republican-style revolution. In 1956, the Egyptian government nationalizes the Suez Canal. So, just to give you, again, a point of reference, let me get a slightly larger picture. There we go. So, Suez Canal is here between Egypt and the Sinai Peninsula. It enables particularly the British, but really all Europeans, to sail to India and to the Far East without having to go around the bottom of Africa. It's on Egyptian territory, but it was built by French engineers with British money, and so until the 1950s, it was owned by the British and the French. In 1956, Egypt announces that it intends to nationalize that, to take it and claim ownership over it, and therefore to get all of the tolls and fees that are paid on going through it, and to be able to use its own military to police it. This does not go over well with England in particular, or with France. France at that point, remember, still has colonies in Southeast Asia. So England and France basically pay Israel to invade Egypt, seize the Suez Canal, and guarantee that it does not fall into Egyptian hands. And in a rare case of American-Soviet cooperation, the Americans and Soviets refused to recognize this, demand that Israel remove itself from the Suez Canal, and the crisis is averted. Now, that's quite different from the situation between the United States and Israel since the 1970s, which has been one of uniform support, mainly, again, because of the position that Israel held as an enemy of Arab states that at that point, in particular in the 1970s, were using oil as an economic lever. Also, until 1991, Israel was a non-communist state in an area that the Soviet Union had a lot of allies. Since 1991, it's been exceedingly more difficult for the United States to justify its support for Israel at the expense of the rights of Palestinians, but again, more on that down the road. All of these matters of European and later American power intervening in the Middle East are sort of ongoing issues with regard to the relationship between these areas and the West. Another important series of events is the Arab-Israeli War in 1967. So Israel is established in 1948. It has the borders indicated here, which is to say that it does not include the West Bank, it does not include the Gaza Strip. In 1967, the Egyptian government begins to talk very loudly about its intentions to destroy Israel. It's been saying that for the previous 20 years, but now it really seems to mean it, including sort of moving its air force up to the border. The president of Egypt on the radio constantly talking about how they're going to push the Jews into the sea and the rivers are going to flow with blood and blah, 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 blah. Israel, quite worried about this, strikes preemptively, destroys the Egyptian Air Force on the ground, seizes the entire Sinai Peninsula, and holds it for 10 years. So, and then on top of it, it seizes the Gaza Strip, it seizes the West Bank, and it seizes East Jerusalem, which is not on this map, but nevertheless is basically right here. So, since then, Israel has evacuated the Gaza Strip, but it still controls its borders and its airspace. It evacuated the Sinai Peninsula in 1977, as I mentioned, in exchange for a peace treaty with Egypt. But it still is in the West Bank, and in addition to being in the West Bank, it has significantly settled its own civilian population in the West Bank, about 500,000 people. And it's annexed East Jerusalem outright, all of which, with the exception of the United States, and Israel is viewed to be in violation of international law. So this is the big bone of contention with the Arab world, between the Arab world and the United States. The fact that we put troops in Saudi Arabia wasn't great and was the main complaint that al-Qaeda had. It was their biggest complaint against the United States because of the import that they put on Mecca and Medina, and by extension the country. But the view of the Arab world with regard to American support for Israel has been that, although it's moderated, particularly in the last 15 years, for the first 60 years of Israel's existence was basically that Israel flatly could not exist in the region, and as a result, America's support for it was an affront to the Arab world. And this was a huge bone of contention, and it remains one. Although, as I mentioned, for the last 15 years or so, there's basically been a kind of thaw in the relations between the Arab states and Israel, with the exception of the Palestinians, that if Israel normalizes the situation with the Palestinians, the Arab countries will recognize Israel. But the likelihood of that is fairly distant. So, the reason that the '67 war and the subsequent occupation of the Palestinian territories is significant is not only because it's a huge bone of contention, but also because it gives rise to the Palestinian Liberation Organization. Now, it's already existed before 1967, and it is founded with the express purpose of destroying Israel and returning Palestinian exiles and refugees, which today number 4 to 5 million. But with the occupation of the West Bank, Gaza Strip, and East Jerusalem, the PLO is highly energized. In 1969, a man named Yasser Arafat is elected chair of the PLO, and he begins to conduct an extensive guerrilla war against Israel. This will include terrorism. This will include attacks on civilians, not just Israeli civilians either. It will include attacks on Americans for their support of Israel. And it is actually beginning in 1968 or 1969 is the beginning of significant common terrorism in that part of the world being committed by Muslims. But there's a caveat there, and that is that the PLO is a secular organization with some Christian leadership. So when the PLO are carrying out terrorist attacks, it's purely political. There's no religious bent to what they're doing. They're not fundamentalists. In fact, they are very averse to Islamic fundamentalism, not only because there are non-Muslims within its ranks, but also because they are very far on the left politically, strongly supported by the Soviet Union, and therefore they envision some form of a socialist state being established in Palestine if they were to win in a war against Israel, and Islamic fundamentalism would not go along with that. So the primary sort of driver of terrorism in this part of the world, beginning in the 1960s, is the Israeli-Palestine conflict. And it's Muslims carrying out most of the terrorist activity, but again, not for, it's almost sort of incidental that the people that are committing the terrorism are Muslim. By the way, this is not the beginning of terrorism, obviously. I mean, there's terrorism going on all over the world for different reasons. There's, at this point, while this is going on, there's terrorism being carried out by Hindus in Sri Lanka. There's terrorism being carried out by Hindus, for that matter, in Kashmir, and by Muslims against Hindus in Kashmir. There's terrorism being carried out by Protestants and Catholics against each other in Northern Ireland. And again, in most of these cases, religion is more of a excuse rather than the underlying actual dispute. It changes, though, significantly in 1979. There are a series of extremely important events that happen in that year that really galvanize Islamic fundamentalism and sort of put it on steroids. So the first thing is that the Islamic Revolution in Iran begins at the beginning of the year. And although Shia Muslims represent only a minority, a small minority for that matter, in the Muslim world, it nevertheless is inspirational to the entire Muslim world, at least among fundamentalists, because it indicates that there's a possibility to these fundamentalists that they can be ascendant in power, that they can sort of overthrow these power structures that they see as highly corrupt, as complicit with the West in their continued subjugation, so on and so forth. Iran is declared an Islamic Republic in April of that year, and 6 months later, Iran takes more than 400 hostages, or I'm sorry, more than 50 hostages for more than 400 days in the American embassy in Tehran, the capital of Iran. And this is sort of the, although it's been building for a while, this is the big flashpoint of tension between the United States and Iran. I don't know if any of you happened to see the president speaking at the UN today, rattling the saber of war against Iran, but this is basically why. Second event that happens in November is that there is the seizure of the Grand Mosque in Mecca. So although the Saudi royal family, it promulgates this puritanical fundamentalist form of Islam, it nevertheless is the case that they are viewed by other fundamentalists within Saudi Arabia and in the Muslim world at large as being highly corrupt, in the pay of the Americans in particular, sort of drunk on oil money and not really Muslim. And as an expression of this anger at the Saudi royal family, there is a seizure by fundamentalists of the Grand Mosque in Mecca during the Hajj. If you know anything about Islam, you know that one of the responsibilities of any Muslim who has the economic means to be able to do so is to travel at least once in his or her life to Saudi Arabia during the month of the Hajj and visit the Grand Mosque in Mecca. While this is going on, Islamic fundamentalists actually seize the mosque. There's a standoff for several weeks until, as noted on December 4th, the Saudi army ends the siege, kills the people who have seized it, and this does not make the fundamentalists who have been supporting the seizure particularly happy. The day after this happens, the U.S. Embassy in Pakistan is attacked. It's based on rumors that the United States has invaded Saudi Arabia in order to get the guerrillas out of the Grand Mosque, which is, of course, untrue. But finally, and maybe most importantly of all, on Christmas Eve in 1979, the Soviet Union invades Afghanistan. And they're there for 8 years, and they don't win. Right? They leave finally after 8 years, very much defeated. What's significant about this is not only that it galvanizes the entire Islamic world against the Soviet Union, which had not happened before despite the Soviet Union having a significantly large Muslim population in Central Asia, but once they have breached Islamic land that did not previously belong to Russia, this is viewed as a step way too far. And so the volunteers that go to Afghanistan to fight the Soviets come from all over the Muslim world. From as far west as Bosnia and Albania, and in Europe as far east as Indonesia, they volunteer because they see this as a legitimate jihad, as the defense of Islamic territory against encroachment by non-Muslims. The other thing that happens, by the way, is that the United States begins to dump a huge amount of money to these people that are fighting the Soviets, because, of course, we've been fighting the Soviets in a Cold War at this point for 25 years. And the last thing that we want to see happen is for the Soviets to get a foothold in South Asia and then maybe begin to move on Pakistan, which is our ally. So we begin to pay a huge amount of money to these people called mujahideen, warriors. A prominent one of whom, by the way, is Osama bin Laden. So Osama bin Laden becomes prominent by being a mujahideen leader in Afghanistan during the 1980s. He is on the CIA payroll for years and years and years. And it's not until long after the war in Afghanistan is over that he turns on the United States and sort of gets these ideas that he ends up carrying out September 11th on the basis of. Questions? So as I mentioned earlier, the United States was involved in a coup against the Iranian government in 1953. This man, Mohammad Mossadegh, was elected the prime minister of Iran in 1951 and moved to nationalize the oil industry. So as I mentioned before, British Petroleum owned the oil industry in Iran, but it gave a significant percentage, but still a minority percentage, to the Iranian government, which at that point was in the hands of the Shah, the monarch of Iran. So in response to this, the British declare a boycott of Iranian oil, and they will use their sea power to enforce this. Although they are no longer the most powerful navy in the world, they are still the second most powerful navy, and so they can do some real damage with this. Plus, their closest military ally is the United States, so that's going to go a long way toward helping the British address this situation, which they are none too happy about. So between the monarch, the Shah Mohammad Reza Pahlavi, and Mossadegh, there is increasing tension because remember the Shah of Iran, the monarch in Iran, has been in power for the last 11 years because the United States and the Soviet Union put him there. Right? His father had been overthrown during World War II, and for the previous 11 years until 1952, he had been a very close ally, in particular of the United States, not so much of the Soviet Union, because he was very strongly anti-communist. They begin to fight each other over their relative powers. The Shah is a constitutional monarch, so his powers are conscribed to a certain extent, and there are elections, and the prime minister is normally the winner of those elections. But now Mossadegh wants greater executive power, and the Shah is looking to deny him that. The problem is that Mossadegh has significant popular support, because he's telling the people what is probably true, which is that if the oil industry in Iran is nationalized, then it will be possible for there to be even greater economic prosperity for the Iranian people than they already have, which is already significantly greater than they had 50 years earlier, but there's still significant poverty across the country. Ultimately, the Shah flees the country, and it is not until the following year, when the CIA launches this operation with British support, that Mossadegh is overthrown, the Shah is put back into power, and then he's very strongly supported by the United States for the next 25 years. This is a point that the Iranians will return to again and again in their disputes with the United States. So when the United States rightly says to the Iranians that they don't want their citizens held hostage in the American embassy, the Iranian response will be, at least in part, you should have thought of that before you came into the country 25 years ago and overthrew the prime minister and kept the oil industry for yourself, and so on and so forth. On top of that, when they returned the Shah to power in Iran in the 1950s, he took on much greater power than he'd held before, and he began to institute a fairly severe regime of oppression against dissidents. For one thing, he founded a secret police agency to root out political dissenters and religious radicals called Sabak. It was notorious for its use of torture. So he was looking basically in using secret police to go after two particular groups of enemies, socialists and communists on the one hand, and religious authorities on the other hand who were seeking his ouster. And part of understanding why the religious authorities were upset with him has to do with then this thing that he institutes once he comes back into power called the White Revolution. So this is viewed, and probably rightly so, it is viewed as a very progressive agenda for national transformation. It has two main prongs involved in it. The first is land reform. So until the 1960s, a significant amount of land in Iran is owned by the religious authorities. And the Shah, who is not particularly religious himself, and who is suspicious of the religious authorities because they view him with suspicion because of his close relationship with the United States, he seizes their land, and then he requisitions it out to poor Iranians for farmland. Second thing that he does is he institutes a widespread campaign of women's liberation. So women in Iran get to vote for the first time. They are allowed to now appear in public without having to veil themselves, and a bunch of other sort of liberalizations to undermine the patriarchy with which the religious authorities are so comfortable. So these two things really anger the religious authorities in Iran, who are who hold a really important societal position both culturally and religiously. Not only religiously, because even though it's a largely non-religious country, it nevertheless incorporates Shia Islam into its national identity, and so it sees the Ayatollahs, the Shia Muslim clerics, as being important sort of embodiments of legitimate Persian culture. Not only that, but they're angry that they got their land taken away, because of course, who wouldn't be? They're also, and then on top of it, they're angry that now women are not veiling themselves in public, which they see as an affront against Islam. So many important religious and dissident figures leave the country, notably the Ayatollah Khomeini. He will go into exile in Saudi Arabia first and then into France. This is after he's arrested and tortured and the whole nine yards. So his hatred for the Shah and the Shah's regime is sort of boundless. And he, of course, being a religious authority, is conservative on that level, but the opposition that he experiences with the Shah really makes him sort of truly reactionary. So here's the Ayatollah Khomeini. He is sort of world-renowned through the 1960s for being a religious scholar. He's sort of widely cited in the religious literature of Shia Muslims all over the world, and is really known for that more than anything else. But when, in the 1960s, he begins to criticize the Shah publicly, and the White Revolution specifically, saying that it's wrong that the Shah has taken this land and given it to farmers, that it's wrong that the Shah is allowing women to appear unveiled and allowing them to vote and allowing them to wield political power, he begins to hold demonstrations that in turn leads to rioting, and he finally then is exiled in the 60s. So part of understanding why the Islamic Revolution happens is understanding why the Shah was so unpopular, and that's tied up in the repression through the secret police against particular groups, political groups on the left, and certain groups of religious Iranians. But it also has to do with the economic situation in the 1970s in general, which is bad. Now, it's bad for a lot of reasons, but there are two main ones. The first is that the United States goes off the gold standard, and that sort of shakes up the people's confidence in the United States dollar. And the second thing is that there's an oil embargo against the West at large, basically, but mainly against the United States, which is, after all, the world's largest consumer nation, at least at that point historically, because we have supported Israel in the 1973 war. The result of this is that there is the prices of oil go way sky high, which is great for Iran for part of the time, but then when the United States responds to this by opening up a pipeline in Alaska and glutting the market with oil, remember your principles of economic power, right? If the supply of oil is being artificially held down by the Arab oil embargo, then prices will be very, very high. But then if all of a sudden the United States just throws barrels of oil onto the market, it's going to drive the price even lower than it was before. That's going to decimate the economies in these countries that have suffered to begin with, because even though the price is high, they're not selling. At least they're selling to fewer people. But now that their oil has become less worth far less than it was when the whole crisis began, there's widespread sort of economic distress, and this comes in an unusual form throughout the world, which is that there's very high inflation and very high unemployment, which is almost the worst things that you can combine in an economy. So there's recession, there's poor growth, but on top of it, with people being out of work, it costs them a lot more to get basic goods. And that affects everywhere. It affects us as much as it does everywhere else in the world, but for those countries that are as deeply dependent on oil as these countries are, it affects them particularly badly. So as a result of all of these things, the economic distress in Iran, the unpopularity of the Shah's regime for all these reasons, public protests begin against the Shah in January of 1978. He turns the army on the protests who kill protesters, and this has the opposite effect of getting rid of it. Instead, the protests simply grow. Over the course of that year, the Shah declares martial law. He continues to use the army against protesters, and so the body count begins to rise. But a real turning point is when there is a nationwide general strike called in October. General strike has the effect, and basically what it means is that all of the workers' unions agree to not work. It just shuts down the economy, so that it cripples the entire country to such an extent that it has two effects. First of all, the government panics because it doesn't get any revenue, and the people get angry because they're not getting any of the goods and services that they need. But they don't take out their anger, generally speaking, against the unions or against the workers, because most of them are union members or workers. They instead get angry at the government that has caused the workers to strike in the first place. And so that destabilizes things even more. Khomeini comes back and emerges, strangely enough, for all of the kind of left-wing tactics that are being used by the protesters. He emerges as a leader of the revolution, despite his status as a religious figure. The Shah appoints a new prime minister and goes into exile, and Khomeini returns in February, appoints his own government, declares an Islamic Republic, and by the summer there is a new constitution. It is a Republican government in Iran with religious oversight. So there is elections in Iran. They have been free at points in the recent past. They've also been badly tampered with in the recent past. The main thing that makes it an Islamic Republic is that there is religious oversight. So there is a supreme leader in Iran. That person is today an Ayatollah, as well as it having been before, and if the government does something that the Ayatollah doesn't like, he can overturn it. So there's an absolute veto held by the religious authorities within Iran, and that's what makes it an Islamic government rather than a Republican government in this sort of the the broadest sense of the term. So I asked you to look at some writing from the Ayatollah Khomeini, and this is in the book on page 665. So please turn there to page 665. I don't want to spend a lot of time on this because a lot of what he talks about here is not hugely relevant for a better understanding of ideological power, so much as it is a better understanding of why Islamic fundamentalism as a form of ideological power comes to the fore in the first place. So Khomeini's main argument here, and this is a speech that he gave in public on the first anniversary, I think, of the Islamic Revolution, is that he justifies the Islamic Revolution on the basis of a reaction to imperialism, which hopefully I've demonstrated is at least the justification that is often given, if not it being the sort of the universally accepted truth. So for instance, if you look on page 666, in the second paragraph on that page, he mentions Eastern societies, and he includes within Eastern societies Iran. That, by the way, is kind of an artificial construction, just to be clear. So, broadly speaking, when we talk about East and West, we're talking about, West is Europe and the Western Hemisphere, and East is Asia, right? But Islam is much closer to a Western form of civilization than an Eastern form of civilization, mainly for religious reasons, right? Because Christianity is a major marker of Western civilization, even if it's just the rejection of it. It nevertheless lies as an underpinning of what we mean when we talk about Western civilization. It was the state religion in Rome, and therefore it spread widely throughout Europe and subsequently in the world. So his division is a strange one, but I just wanted to point that out because it's not as if when we tend to think of Eastern, we tend to think of Chinese, Japanese, Korean, Southeast Asia, those kinds of areas, and South Asia as well. And that's a kind of religious division, right? The religions that are most common in those areas, with the exception of those areas that are Muslim, which are granted Eastern, are Hinduism, Buddhism, Taoism, and so on and so forth. And these are sort of fundamentally different religious ideologies and in their underpinning. So, I mean, if we draw the line in a religious basis, and to some extent because it's a religious argument, you kind of have to. His division is more one between the West, imperialists, and the East, the colonized, and that's kind of how he means it. So he says, Eastern societies which by means of internal and external propaganda, by means of the orders of the internal and external agents, have turned to the West and have the direction of their prayers. The West have lost themselves. They do not know themselves. They have lost their gloriousness and honor, and in place of that sits a Western mind. Their saints are idols. They have entered darkness from the plague. So that's his sort of broad critique of Western society, and here, he's sort of pointing the biggest finger at the United States. And this, he says, has been the cause of suffering for Iranians. All of the problems of Easterners, and among them our problems and miseries, are the very cause of our losing ourselves, and someone is sitting in place of us. Thus, you see that in Iran, until someone does not have a Western name, it is not accepted. Even a drugstore must have a Western name. The material woven in our factories must have something in the Latin script, in its selvages, and a Western name is put upon it. And then he continues, the streets have to have Western names, or else they're not taken seriously. And he tells this story about Amin al-Mulk, who he says that he was an eye doctor in Iran when Khomeini was a kid. And when Khomeini was a child, he had a problem with his eyes, and so he goes to see the eye doctor, Amin al-Mulk, And Amin al-Mulk says, he goes to see Amin al-Mulk, and he said one of the dulls of the court had become nearsighted. He had gone to Europe to see a doctor. That doctor asked him, where are you from? In answer, he said, I'm from Iran. The doctor said, isn't Amin al-Mulk there? He had answered, he may be, but I do not know him. That professor had then said, Amin al-Mulk is better than we. So the story is told by Khomeini to make this point that, and it's an historical point as well as a cultural point. So medicine is by and large, as it's practiced today, it originates in the Islamic world. It sort of, the core of it comes from ancient Greece, but the Muslims take it and really sort of, they really run with it. They do things like they figure out sanitization and the way to prevent infections. The hospital is by and large an Islamic creation. And so most of the important medieval medical texts come from the Muslim world, also from Iran as well as from what's now Iraq in Baghdad. He says, well, if we have this great sort of history of great scientific thinking, then why is it that when somebody has a medical problem, and we have some of the oldest medical traditions in the world that are actually valid and proved, then why do they go to Europe to get their vision care when they could get just as good medical care here? And he says it's because we've been infected with this idea that to be Western, to be American or European, is better than to be Iranian. He turns at the bottom of 667 to the idea of what's happened with the women in Iran since the White Revolution is sort of an infection of a Western idea. The attention of some of our women is turned to the idea that such and such a mode must come from the West, and such an ornamentation must move from there to here, so that whenever something is found there, it is imitated here. As long as you do not put aside these imitations, you cannot be a human being. So he's drawing a very firm line that to allow yourself to be corrupted by the Western idea of what it means to be a woman is to actually undermine your own humanity. But there's an obvious kind of critique that arises that he's aware of, right? I mean, because let's face it, it's not as if Iran is a place where you can live today where you're going to be able to exercise a whole lot of personal freedom, right? Women in Iran under the Islamic Republic over the course of the last 40 years have lost significant rights. They're still actually able to be represented in parliament. They're still able to vote, but they can no longer appear in public without being veiled, right? They no longer have the same rights in courts that they used to have under the Shah. So it's necessary for him to justify that. It's also necessary for him to justify something like, well, in Iran, they execute drug traffickers. Doesn't matter if they've killed anybody or not. And so he says, there's this critique that comes of our country where we're told that we do not have any freedom. And he says on 669, about halfway through the paragraph on the top of the page, this is a type of freedom which we have to call colonialist freedom. This is other than freedom which must be amidst the people. This is a type of freedom which has come from abroad. They've brought us and our young people up like this. And then he says, yeah, you want freedom? Freedom for you to become addicted to heroin? We don't need that kind of freedom. Freedom so that, your women become pregnant out of wedlock? We don't need that kind of freedom. We have the freedom of being authentically Iranian. And as a result of that, he says, that is actually our victory over colonialism. So again, I mean, the arguments here are not so much a justification of fundamentalism, because for somebody like Khomeini, or for any fundamentalist for that matter, the justification is sort of self-evident for them. Obviously this is true, and so why would I need to justify what it is that I'm doing? Instead, the justification has to be cultural, because he has to justify this belief not to himself or to people that agree with him, so much as he has to justify it to a country of people that have been used to something quite different. And as a result of that, it's necessary then to draw the lines culturally speaking, rather than strictly religiously speaking. We'll return to this a little bit when we talk about colonialism, because it's similar, although not exactly identical, to a point that Gandhi makes about independence for India, which is that if India gets independence, when Gandhi is writing in the 1930s in particular, he says that if India is going to be independent, it has to be authentically Indian independence. If it's independence, but India becomes a state like any other European state, then it won't be worth it. If the end result of Indian independence is that we keep doing things as the British did them, with all the same sort of negative consequences, then we might as well just stay colonialized. The argument is a similar one here. If we don't throw off everything that being allied with the West for all of those years did to our society, including the liberation of women, then we need to be sure that we do, or else our revolution won't be an authentically Iranian revolution, or an authentically, from his standpoint, Islamic revolution. So, last question for a short discussion. What is the solution to the United States' ongoing fight against Islamic fundamentalism? How do we solve this problem? Because we go into, so September 11th happens, right? And clearly we are, rather angry about this, and it's difficult to see why not. And so we go after Afghanistan and Osama bin Laden and chase him down for the better part of a decade, and finally, get him. But we go into Afghanistan, at least in part, with the goal of overthrowing a fundamentalist regime there under the Taliban. And it sort of worked, but the Taliban is still definitely there. And they still definitely have a base of power upon which they're able to operate. And they still regularly carry out guerrilla action against the quote-unquote legitimate government. So although we can certainly say that we have significantly mitigated the ability of Al-Qaeda to wage war against us, we definitely have. It's not as if there have not been both other terrorist organizations, notably ISIS, that have risen up consequently. So the idea of Islamic fundamentalism hasn't gone away, nor has the idea that Islamic fundamentalists mainly want to target us as their primary, enemy. So, and then, on top of this, over the course of the last 5 years, there's been this tremendous refugee crisis that arose as a result of the civil war in Syria, which has made this problem significantly worse and not better, because it has a radicalizing effect, right? I mean, so whereas before you could pretty much count on the base of Islamic fundamentalism coming from places that had been radicalized through all these things I was talking about before tonight, mainly from Pakistan, sort of the main place where it was coming from over the course of the last several decades. Now it's coming from Europe and the United States, among migrants and among refugees who are being radicalized in Europe rather than or in the United States, rather than in a madrasa in Pakistan, like Osama bin Laden was. So what do you do about that? I mean, what is the solution? On the one hand, there is, and you can sort of take the situation in Europe as a way of comparing approaches. On the one hand, you have the UK. The UK has said that both the UK and France have Muslim populations between 5 and 10%, both of which are growing, both of which are based on their accepting of former colonial residents of former colonial nations to emigrate there at will. On top of that, there's also large refugee populations in both, but for the UK, their Muslim population has come mainly from Pakistan and Bangladesh, to a lesser extent from West Africa. And that population has been integrated